The six-stage revolution cycle has destroyed every major empire in the last 500 years. Spain controlled half the world's wealth and collapsed in less than a century. Britain ruled a quarter of the Earth's surface and lost it all in 4 decades. The Soviet Union went from superpower to non-existent in 900 days. 3 empires, 3 complete collapses. Same 6 stages every single time. And right now, in 2025, the United States has already completed stage 5. We're not approaching the pattern, we're living inside it. The math doesn't care about American exceptionalism. It didn't care about Spanish gold, British naval supremacy, or Soviet nuclear arsenals either. This is the story of how empires die, why they always think they're different, and why the historical data says we're next. The clock is already running. But the story behind it isn't what you think. Most people believe empires fall because of invasion or military defeat. That's not how it works. Empires collapse from the inside, following a predictable economic and social sequence that has repeated itself with mathematical precision for centuries. Stay tuned, because understanding this pattern might be the most important thing you learn this year. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden patterns of the 6-stage revolution cycle and why they matter today. We'll break down each stage using real historical data from 3 collapsed empires. You'll see exactly where the United States sits in this cycle right now. And later, you'll discover the one factor in stage 5 that could trigger stage 6 faster than anyone expects. By the end, you'll understand why the timeline has already started. Before we dive into the 6 stages, you need to understand what revolution cycles actually are. Not the sanitized textbook version, the brutal reality of how superpowers implode. A revolution cycle isn't a military coup or a sudden overthrow. It's an economic and social pattern that unfolds over decades, sometimes generations. It's the slow-motion collapse of the systems that made an empire powerful in the first place. Think of it as a predictable sequence of decisions and consequences that empires make when they reach their peak and start the inevitable descent. Here's the critical part that historians often miss. Every empire believes it's immune to the pattern. Spanish leaders in 1600 couldn't imagine their empire collapsing. They had more gold and silver than anyone in history. British politicians in 1920 thought the empire would last forever. They controlled the seas and the global reserve currency. Soviet leaders in 1985 believed the USSR was permanent. They had nuclear weapons and global influence. They were all wrong. And they were wrong for the same reason. They confused current strength with permanent power. They saw their advantages and assumed those advantages would continue indefinitely. They ignored the economic mathematics that were already working against them. The 6-stage revolution cycle explains why that happens. It maps the specific decisions empires make at each stage and the inevitable consequences that follow. Stage 1 is the peak, the golden age when everything seems possible. Stage 2 is overextension, when the empire expands beyond its sustainable limits. Stage 3 is currency debasement, when they try to print their way out of the problem. Stage 4 is social fracture, when internal divisions tear the society apart. Stage 5 is loss of reserve status, when the economic foundation crumbles. And Stage 6 is rapid collapse, when the entire structure implodes faster than anyone thought possible. What makes this pattern so dangerous is its invisibility during the early stages. When Spain was bringing home 200 tons of silver per year in 1550, nobody saw the collapse coming. When Britain controlled the largest empire in human history in 1914, the idea of losing it all seemed absurd. When the Soviet Union was the other superpower in 1980, suggesting it would cease to exist in a decade would have been laughed at. But the pattern was already in motion. The decisions were already made. The consequences were already locked in. Let's be clear about what we're analyzing here. We're not talking about moral judgments or political opinions. We're talking about economic mathematics. Empires operate within certain constraints. They need productive capacity to generate wealth. They need trade to circulate that wealth. They need currency stability to maintain confidence. They need social cohesion to enforce decisions. When those foundations crack, the empire enters the cycle. And once the cycle begins, history shows it's almost impossible to reverse. Spain, Britain, Soviet Union, 3 different empires, 3 different time periods, 3 different political systems. But The same 6 stages played out with remarkable consistency. The speed varied. Spain took 80 years from peak to collapse. Britain took 40 years. The Soviet Union took less than 15 years. But the sequence was identical, and here's what should keep you awake at night. The United States entered Stage 1 in the 1990s after winning the Cold War. We moved into Stage 2 in the early 2000s with military overextension in Iraq and Afghanistan. We accelerated into Stage 3 with the 2008 financial crisis and the money printing that followed. We crossed into Stage 4 around 2016 with the political polarization that has only intensified since. And we entered Stage 5 in 2023 when BRICS nations and Saudi Arabia started conducting oil trades in currencies other than the dollar. 5 of 6 stages complete. That's not speculation. That's documented reality. The question isn't whether the United States is in the cycle. The question is how fast we move from Stage 5 to Stage 6, because that's where the acceleration happens. That's where decades of accumulated problems suddenly cascade into systemic failure. That's where empires don't just decline, they implode. Before we go through each stage in detail, understand this. The pattern doesn't care about intentions. Spain didn't want to collapse. Britain didn't plan to lose the empire. The Soviet Union wasn't trying to cease existing, but they made predictable decisions at each stage. They chose short-term solutions over long-term sustainability. They printed money instead of making hard choices. They expanded militarily instead of strengthening economically. They polarized internally instead of building cohesion. And the mathematics of empire did the rest. The 6-stage revolution cycle isn't a conspiracy theory or a political argument. It's pattern recognition based on 500 years of historical data. It's the same sequence playing out over and over with the same results. And right now, whether we acknowledge it or not, the United States is following that exact same script. So, what are these 6 stages? How do they actually work? Why does every empire make the same mistakes? And most importantly, what does Stage 5 mean for what happens next? Let's start at the beginning. Let's start with the Golden Age. Let's start with Stage 1, when everything seems permanent and the idea of collapse seems impossible, because that's where the pattern always begins. That's where empires plant the seeds of their own destruction without even realizing it. Stage 1 is the Golden Age, the moment when an empire reaches its absolute peak, when military power is unquestioned, when economic dominance seems permanent, when the currency is accepted everywhere, when allies line up for protection, when enemies retreat or submit. This is the stage where empires feel invincible, where leaders believe their system is superior, where the population experiences unprecedented prosperity. And this is the most dangerous stage of all, because Stage 1 plants the seeds of every stage that follows. Let's start with Spain in the 1550s. This is the blueprint. The original global empire that set the pattern every other empire would follow. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Spain spent the next 50 years conquering the richest civilizations in the New World. They destroyed the Aztec Empire in Mexico. They toppled the Inca Empire in Peru. And they seized control of the largest silver and gold deposits ever discovered by European civilization. The mines at Potosi in modern-day Bolivia produced silver in quantities that seemed infinite. By 1550, Spanish galleons were bringing home 200 tons of silver per year. By 1600, that number had increased to over 300 tons annually. The Spanish Empire controlled territory on every continent. The sun never set on Spanish land. Their military was the most feared in Europe. The Spanish tercios, elite infantry formations, were undefeated in major battles for over a century. Their navy dominated the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. The Spanish real, their currency, was accepted from Manila to Madrid. They were the first truly global superpower. King Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, controlled the richest empire on earth. More wealth flowed through Spain in those decades than through any kingdom in human history up to that point. The treasure fleets arriving from the Americas brought such vast quantities of precious metals that Spain seemed to have unlimited resources. This is Stage 1. Peak prosperity, unquestioned dominance, the belief that power is permanent. Now, let's jump forward 350 years to Britain in the 1890s and early 1900s. By 1914, the British Empire was the largest empire in human history. They controlled 25% of the Earth's land surface. They ruled over 400 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population. British naval supremacy was absolute. The Royal Navy had more battleships than the next two nations combined. Britain controlled the critical trade routes, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Malacca, Gibraltar. Their colonies stretched from Canada to Australia to India to South Africa. But here's what really mattered. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. When international trade happened, it happened in pounds. When nations needed to hold reserves, they held pounds. When debts were denominated, they were denominated in pounds. This gave Britain extraordinary economic leverage. They could borrow at low rates. They could finance massive projects. They could maintain their empire at a cost other nations couldn't match. The British believed their empire would last 1,000 years. They called it the Pax Britannica, the British peace. They saw their dominance as not just military or economic, but civilizational. They genuinely believed they had discovered the formula for permanent power. Stage 1. Peak prosperity, global dominance, the illusion of permanence. Now, the Soviet Union, 1970s and early 1980s. The USSR in this period was the other superpower. They had nuclear parity with the United States. They had the largest army in the world. They controlled Eastern Europe. They had clients and allies on every continent. Cuba in the Americas, Angola and Ethiopia in Africa, Vietnam and North Korea in Asia, Syria and Egypt in the Middle East. Their military spending rivaled the United States despite having a smaller economy. They launched satellites, built advanced weapons systems, maintained a massive intelligence apparatus. Soviet citizens in the 1970s experienced the highest standard of living in Soviet history. Food was available, housing was guaranteed, employment was universal, education and healthcare were free. The Communist Party leadership believed they were winning the Cold War. They thought capitalism would collapse first. They saw their system as historically inevitable. Peak military power, superpower status, the certainty of victory. And now, the United States 1990s and early 2000s. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, America became the sole superpower, the unipolar moment. We had won the Cold War without firing a shot. Our economy was the largest in the world. Our military was unmatched. The dollar was the unquestioned global reserve currency. We had alliances spanning the globe. NATO in Europe, defense treaties in Asia. Our technology dominated. Our culture spread everywhere. Our political systems seemed to have triumphed. The 1990s were prosperous. The stock market soared. The tech boom created unprecedented wealth. Budget deficits turned into surpluses. Unemployment was low. Inflation was controlled. The phrase "end of history" captured the mood. Some believed liberal democracy and market capitalism had permanently won, that we had reached the final form of human political and economic organization. This was America's peak prosperity, unquestioned dominance, the belief that our power was different, permanent, exceptional. But here's what every empire misses during stage 1. The golden age contains the seeds of collapse, because peak prosperity creates specific behaviors that guarantee decline. First, it creates complacency. When everything is working, why change? Spain saw the silver flowing in and assumed it would continue forever. Britain saw the empire functioning and assumed it was sustainable. The Soviets saw military power and assumed economic fundamentals didn't matter. America saw the 1990s boom and assumed our advantages were permanent. Second, it creates overconfidence. Empires at their peak start taking risks they wouldn't take otherwise. They make commitments they can't sustain. They extend beyond their natural limits. They believe their power makes them immune to normal constraints. Third, it creates moral hazard. When you're dominant, you can make mistakes and get away with it. Spain debased their currency early, and the inflation was manageable at first. Britain took on debt, and their reserve currency status made it cheap. The Soviets subsidized client states, and their military kept it together. America started running massive deficits, and the dollar's reserve status made it possible. These behaviors compound. The complacency prevents necessary reforms. The overconfidence leads to overextension. The moral hazard creates dependencies that become unsustainable. And here's the kicker. During stage 1, the warning signs are already visible. They are just ignored. Spain's silver imports were causing inflation even during the peak. Prices in Spain rose 400% between 1500 and 1600. But they had so much silver coming in, it didn't seem like a problem yet. Britain's empire was already expensive to maintain in the 1890s. The Boer War in South Africa from 1899 to 1902 cost more than expected and revealed military weaknesses. But Britain was so wealthy, they covered the costs. The Soviet Union's economy was already stagnating in the 1970s. Growth rates were declining, technology was falling behind, consumer goods were scarce. But military power masked the economic problems. America in the 1990s was already accumulating long-term problems. Manufacturing was moving overseas, income inequality was rising, infrastructure was aging, the financial sector was growing disproportionately large, but the stock market boom and the peace dividend from the Cold War's end made everything seem fine. This is why stage 1 is so dangerous. It feels like permanence. It looks like strength, but it's actually the setup for everything that follows. Because empires at their peak make decisions based on current strength, not future sustainability. They spend more than they should. They commit to more than they can maintain. They assume advantages will continue, and they always assume they're different. Spain thought their silver mines made them special. Britain thought their navy and empire made them permanent. The Soviets thought their ideology and military made them inevitable. America thinks our innovation and dollar dominance make us exceptional, but the pattern doesn't care about exceptionalism. The pattern cares about mathematics. And the mathematics are clear. Peak prosperity leads to behaviors that create the next stage. The golden age contains the transition to overextension built right into it. Because here's what happens at the peak. Empires look around and see their dominance. They see their wealth. They see their military. And they think, what else can we accomplish? Where else can we expand? What other threats can we eliminate? They don't ask, what can we sustain? What are our limits? Where should we consolidate? And that mindset shift from maintaining strength to extending power is the bridge from stage 1 to stage 2. Spain at its peak decided to fight wars across Europe, maintain a massive empire in the Americas, and defend Catholicism everywhere. Britain at its peak decided to maintain colonies on every continent, fight in World War I, and keep the Royal Navy dominant globally. The Soviets at their peak decided to compete in an arms race with America, maintain client states worldwide, and invade Afghanistan. America at its peak decided to maintain military bases in 150 countries, fight wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and serve as the world's policeman. These aren't irrational decisions in the moment. They seem logical when you're at the peak. You have the resources, you have the power. Why not use it? But each commitment is another obligation. Each expansion is another cost. Each promise is another liability. And these commitments don't scale linearly. They scale exponentially. Because every new commitment requires resources not just to establish, but to maintain indefinitely. And maintenance costs rise over time. Spain's empire required more soldiers every year to hold rebellious territories. Britain's empire required more ships, more administrators, more subsidies as colonies modernized. The Soviet Union's client states required more economic support as their own economies failed. America's global military presence requires more spending every year as technology advances and threats multiply. The golden age feels permanent, but it's the shortest stage of the cycle because the behaviors it creates accelerate the transition to the next stage. And the next stage is where the mathematics start working against you, where the commitments exceed the capacity, where overextension begins. Spain moved from stage 1 to stage 2 in the 1560s and 1570s as they took on more wars and more territory. Britain moved from stage 1 to stage 2 with World War I. The Soviet Union moved from stage 1 to stage 2 with the arms race and Afghanistan invasion in the late 1970s and early 1980s. America moved from stage 1 to stage 2 in the early 2000s with Iraq and Afghanistan. The transition isn't dramatic. There's no announcement. The empire doesn't feel weaker at first, but the constraints are tightening, the costs are rising, the limits are approaching. And that's when stage 2 begins. Stage 2 is where empires cross the line from sustainable dominance to unsustainable overreach. This is the stage where military and economic commitments exceed the empire's ability to maintain them long term. The empire is still powerful, still winning battles, still expanding. But beneath the surface, the mathematics are turning against them. The costs are outpacing the revenues. The obligations are multiplying faster than the capacity to fulfill them. And here's the critical part. Stage 2 doesn't feel like decline. It feels like the empire is still rising, still achieving, still dominant. That's what makes it so dangerous. By the time the leadership realizes they've overextended, the commitments are already locked in. The costs are already built into the system. And reversing course becomes politically and economically impossible. Let's start with Spain and see how this played out in brutal detail. By the 1560s, Spain was fighting wars on multiple fronts simultaneously. They were defending their territories in Italy against France. They were fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. They were suppressing a massive rebellion in the Netherlands that would last 80 years. They were maintaining their empire in the Americas against pirates, indigenous resistance, and rival colonial powers. And they were defending Catholicism across Europe during the religious wars following the Protestant Reformation. King Philip II believed Spain had a divine mission to defend the Catholic faith and maintain Spanish dominance. So he committed to all these wars simultaneously. Each one seemed justified in isolation. Defending Italy protected Spanish interests. Fighting the Ottomans protected Christian Europe. Holding the Netherlands preserved Spanish territory. Maintaining the American empire brought in the silver. Defending Catholicism was a moral imperative. But altogether, these wars cost more than the silver mines could support. In 1571, Spain fought the Battle of Lepanto against the Ottoman fleet, a major naval engagement in the Mediterranean. They won, but the cost of building and maintaining the fleet drained resources. In 1588, Philip II launched the Spanish Armada against England. 130 ships, 30,000 men, the largest naval invasion force assembled up to that point. It failed catastrophically. Half the ships were lost. 20,000 men died, and Spain had to rebuild the entire fleet. Meanwhile, the Netherlands rebellion was bleeding Spain dry. The Dutch were fighting a guerrilla war that Spanish armies couldn't crush. Every year, Spain sent more soldiers, more supplies, more gold to the Netherlands. And every year, the Dutch resistance continued. The war lasted from 1568 to 1648, 80 years. And it cost Spain more than all the silver from the Americas during that period. This is stage 2, multiple wars, multiple commitments, costs rising faster than revenues. But Spain couldn't stop. Withdrawing from the Netherlands would mean admitting defeat. Stopping the religious wars would mean abandoning their mission. Reducing the military would mean looking weak. So, they kept spending, kept borrowing, kept extending beyond their limits. And the silver that had seemed infinite in stage 1 became insufficient in stage 2. Not because the mines produced less, they produced more, but because the military costs grew even faster. Now Britain, early 20th century. Britain entered World War I in 1914 believing it would be a short war. They had the largest navy, the largest empire, the strongest currency. They expected to defend France, defeat Germany, and return to normal within a year. The war lasted 4 years. It killed 900,000 British soldiers. It cost Britain £35 billion, roughly 5 times their annual GDP. They had to borrow massively, mostly from the United States. They had to liquidate foreign investments. They had to raise taxes to levels never seen before. And they had to make promises to their empire about self-determination and independence to keep colonial troops fighting. But World War I wasn't the only commitment. Britain was simultaneously maintaining the empire, governing India with its 400 million people, holding colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, defending trade routes, maintaining naval supremacy, supporting allies, and competing with emerging powers like Japan and the United States. After World War I ended in 1918, Britain tried to maintain everything. They tried to keep the empire, keep the navy dominant, keep the pound as the reserve currency, keep their position as a great power. But the costs of World War I had fundamentally changed the mathematics. They were no longer the richest nation. They were now a debtor nation. The United States had more industrial capacity. Their empire was becoming more expensive to maintain as nationalist movements grew stronger. Britain faced a choice: consolidate and accept reduced global role, or maintain commitments and drain resources trying to hold on to everything. They chose the second option. They kept the empire, kept the military spending, kept the global commitments, and they kept borrowing and inflating to pay for it all. By the 1930s, Britain was simultaneously preparing for another war with Germany, holding the empire together against independence movements in India and elsewhere, and trying to maintain their currency's reserve status. They were overextended on every front, but they couldn't admit it, because admitting overextension meant accepting decline, and empires don't accept decline voluntarily. This is stage 2. Commitments made during stage 1 that become unsustainable in stage 2. But the political system can't reverse them. The public won't accept retreat. The military insists on maintaining strength. The financial system depends on continued confidence. So, the empire keeps extending even as the foundation weakens. The Soviet Union, late 1970s and 1980s. The USSR in 1979 made a catastrophic decision. They invaded Afghanistan. The reasoning seemed sound. Afghanistan was on their southern border. A communist government there was being threatened by Islamic insurgents. Soviet leaders believed a quick military intervention would stabilize the situation. They expected to be in and out within a year. They stayed for 10 years, lost 15,000 soldiers, spent billions of rubles, and never controlled more than the major cities. The Afghan Mujahideen, funded by the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia, fought a guerrilla war the Soviet military couldn't win. Every year, the Soviets sent more troops, more equipment, more resources. And every year, the war continued. But Afghanistan was just one commitment. The Soviets were simultaneously maintaining the largest military in the world, supporting communist governments in Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and a dozen other countries. Subsidizing Eastern Europe's economies, competing in the arms race with the United States, maintaining a space program, and trying to modernize their own economy. The numbers were unsustainable. Soviet military spending reached 15 to 20% of GDP by the mid-1980s. For context, that's triple what the United States spends today. They were building submarines they couldn't afford to maintain. They were developing weapons systems that bankrupted research budgets. They were supporting client states whose economies were collapsing, and their own economy was stagnating. Growth rates fell from 5% in the 1960s to 2% in the 1970s to under 1% by the early 1980s. Oil prices, which had propped up Soviet finances in the 1970s, collapsed in the mid-1980s. Their industrial technology was falling further behind the West. Consumer goods were increasingly scarce. The black market was growing. But they couldn't reduce military spending. The military was the source of Soviet power. It was the reason they were a superpower. Cutting it meant admitting they couldn't compete. So they kept spending, kept borrowing internally, kept printing rubles, and kept extending beyond their economic capacity. This is stage 2 for every empire. Military and political commitments that made sense at the peak become traps. You can't reduce them without looking weak. You can't maintain them without draining resources. So you keep going, hoping something changes, hoping economic growth returns, hoping costs decrease, hoping rivals back down. But hope isn't strategy, and the mathematics don't care about intentions. Now the United States 2000s to present. America entered stage 2 after September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks created a justification for massive military expansion. We invaded Afghanistan in 2001 to destroy al-Qaeda. We invaded Iraq in 2003 to remove Saddam Hussein. Both wars were supposed to be quick. Afghanistan was supposed to take a few months. Iraq was supposed to take weeks. Mission accomplished was declared in 2003. We stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years, lost 2,400 soldiers, spent over $2 trillion, and left in 2021 with the Taliban back in power. We stayed in Iraq for nearly a decade in heavy combat, then continued military presence afterward. Total cost exceeded $3 trillion when you include veteran care and interest on borrowed money. But Iraq and Afghanistan weren't our only commitments. We simultaneously maintained 800 military bases in over 70 countries. We kept carrier battle groups deployed globally. We maintained security commitments to NATO, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and dozens of other allies. We fought wars and conducted operations in Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Niger, and multiple other countries most Americans can't find on a map. The costs escalated every year. Military spending went from $300 billion in 2000 to over $800 billion by 2020. And that's just the official Pentagon budget. Add intelligence agencies, Homeland Security, Veteran Affairs, and the actual number approaches $1.5 trillion annually. Meanwhile, we made economic commitments that compounded the military overextension, Social Security and Medicare for an aging population, infrastructure that needed rebuilding, education systems that needed investment, healthcare costs that were spiraling, and all of it financed by borrowing because we refused to raise taxes or cut spending. By 2008, we faced a financial crisis that should have forced a reckoning. The banking system nearly collapsed. The economy entered the worst recession since the Great Depression. We should have pulled back, reduced commitments, consolidated. Instead, we bailed out the banks, increased deficit spending, and maintained every global commitment. This is America's Stage 2. We have military commitments spanning the globe that we maintain not because they're sustainable, but because retreating looks like weakness. We have economic promises to our population that we can't afford without massive borrowing. We have a global financial system that depends on the dollar's dominance, which requires us to run trade deficits and accumulate debt indefinitely. And like Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union before us, we can't reverse course. The political system won't allow it. Suggesting we close overseas bases gets you labeled an isolationist. Suggesting we reform Social Security gets you voted out. Suggesting we reduce military spending gets you called weak on defense. So we keep extending, keep spending, keep borrowing, keep committing to more than we can sustain, because Stage 2 feels manageable in the short term. The wars are still winnable. The economy is still growing. The currency is still accepted. The problems feel solvable with more money, more time, more effort. But Stage 2 creates the conditions for Stage 3. Because when you're overextended militarily and economically, when your costs exceed your revenues, when your commitments exceed your capacity, there's only one way out that seems politically acceptable. You manipulate the currency. You print money. You debase the foundation of your economic system to pay for commitments you can't afford through normal means. Spain did it. Britain did it, the Soviet Union did it. And when empires enter Stage 3, the acceleration toward collapse begins in earnest. Stage 3 is the point of no return. This is where empires make the fatal decision to manipulate their currency to pay for commitments they can't afford through legitimate means. They debase the money. They print beyond economic capacity. They sacrifice long-term currency stability for short-term political survival. And once Stage 3 begins, the countdown to collapse accelerates dramatically. Spain reached Stage 3 in the late 1500s and early 1600s. The silver from the Americas that seemed infinite created a false sense of security. Spanish kings believed they could spend without limit because the silver mines would always produce more. But here's what actually happened. The massive influx of silver caused inflation across Spain and Europe. Prices quadrupled between 1500 and 1600. The silver that bought tremendous goods in 1550 bought a fraction of that by 1600. Spain's response was to debase their currency further. They mixed copper with silver coins to stretch the precious metal supply. They issued more currency notes backed by less actual silver. They borrowed from Italian and German bankers at increasingly high interest rates. By 1557, King Philip II declared the first sovereign debt default. He simply refused to pay what Spain owed. He would default again in 1560, 1575, and 1596. 4 sovereign defaults in 40 years. Each default destroyed trust in Spanish finances. Bankers charged higher interest rates. Trade partners demanded payment in actual silver, not Spanish promises. The currency lost value continuously, and the military costs kept rising because wars don't stop just because you can't afford them. Spain kept fighting in the Netherlands, kept defending against the Ottomans, kept maintaining the empire, but they paid for it with increasingly worthless money. By 1640, Spain was functionally bankrupt. The silver mines still produced. The empire still existed on maps, but the economic foundation was destroyed. The currency debasement had eroded trust. The defaults had isolated Spain financially, and they could no longer fund the military necessary to hold everything together. Britain entered Stage 3 during and after World War I. The war forced them to abandon the gold standard temporarily. They printed money to pay for the war effort. They borrowed massively from the United States. And when the war ended, they tried to return to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. This was a disaster. The pound was overvalued. British exports became too expensive. Unemployment soared. The economy stagnated throughout the 1920s. Then came the Great Depression. Britain's financial position deteriorated further. In 1931, they permanently abandoned the gold standard. The pound devalued immediately. Sterling lost 25% of its value against other currencies. Britain began the slow process of losing reserve currency status. International trade that had been conducted in pounds started shifting to dollars. Central banks that had held pound reserves began diversifying. After World War II, Britain was completely dependent on American financial support. The Marshall Plan, the IMF, the World Bank, all dollar-denominated systems that replaced the pound-based system. By 1971, when the United States itself abandoned gold backing for the dollar, the pound was just another floating currency, no longer the global reserve. No longer the foundation of international trade, just the currency of a medium-sized European economy. The Soviet Union entered Stage 3 in the 1980s. The ruble had always been a controlled currency, not freely traded internationally. But during the 1980s, the Soviet government began printing rubles without restraint to pay for Afghanistan, the arms race, subsidies to client states, and their own military. Officially, the ruble had a fixed exchange rate. In reality, the black market exchange rate was 10 to 20 times worse. Soviet citizens knew their currency was worthless. They hoarded dollars, German marks, anything but rubles. By 1989, the Soviet government had lost control of the monetary system. Inflation was accelerating. Store shelves were empty because producers hoarded goods rather than accept rubles. The black market was larger than the official economy. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the ruble became essentially worthless. Savings were wiped out. Pensions became meaningless. An entire population's wealth evaporated because the currency they held had been debased into oblivion. And now, the United States. We entered Stage 3 in 2008 with the financial crisis response. The Federal Reserve began quantitative easing, a technical term for creating dollars out of thin air to buy government bonds and financial assets. They created $4 trillion between 2008 and 2014. Then came 2020 and COVID-19. The government printed another $5 trillion in 2 years. Stimulus checks, business loans, unemployment benefits, all funded by creating new dollars. The M2 money supply, the measure of dollars in circulation, increased 40% between 2020 and 2022. In 2 years, we increased the dollar supply by 40%. That's not economic growth. That's currency debasement. And the consequences followed immediately. Inflation surged to 9% by 2022, the highest in 40 years. Prices for food, energy, housing all spiked. Real wages declined. Savings lost purchasing power. But here's the critical difference between America's Stage 3 and previous empires. We have the global reserve currency. When Spain debased their currency, they suffered immediately. When Britain devalued the pound, they lost reserve status within decades. When the Soviets printed rubles, hyperinflation destroyed them within years. But when America prints dollars, the consequences are distributed globally. Every country holding dollar reserves shares the inflation. Every nation conducting trade in dollars absorbs the debasement. This has delayed the reckoning. It's allowed us to print trillions without immediate collapse. But it's also created Stage 4 and Stage 5 simultaneously. Because the rest of the world is watching. They're seeing the dollar being debased. They're seeing America using reserve currency status as a weapon, sanctioning countries, freezing assets, controlling trade, and they're looking for alternatives. Stage 4 is social fracture, internal division, loss of cohesion. This stage happens simultaneously with stage 3 because currency debasement creates winners and losers domestically. Those holding assets benefit from inflation. Those holding cash get destroyed. Wealth inequality accelerates. Trust in institutions collapses. Political polarization intensifies. Spain in the 1600s saw regions rebel as the currency collapsed. Catalonia revolted in 1640. Portugal broke away in 1640 and regained independence. The Netherlands finally won independence in 1648. The empire fragmented because the center couldn't hold without economic stability. Britain in the mid-20th century saw class warfare intensify. The empire faced independence movements everywhere. India demanded freedom. African colonies revolted. The working class demanded nationalization of industries. The society split between those wanting to hold the empire and those wanting to let it go. Between 1945 and 1970, Britain granted independence to dozens of colonies because they couldn't afford to hold them, and their own society was fracturing over the costs. The Soviet Union in the 1980s experienced glasnost and perestroika, reforms that were supposed to save the system, but instead accelerated collapse. Once people could speak freely, they revealed how bad things actually were. Ethnic tensions exploded. The Baltic states demanded independence. Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia all pushed for autonomy. The Communist Party's authority evaporated. Within 3 years of allowing open discussion, the entire structure collapsed. America today is living through stage 4 in real time. Political polarization is at levels not seen since the Civil War. The country is split almost exactly in half on every major issue. Trust in institutions, government, media, corporations, each other, has collapsed. One party doesn't just disagree with the other. They see them as existential threats. Violence is increasing, rhetoric is apocalyptic, common ground is disappearing. This isn't an accident. This is what happens when currency debasement creates massive wealth inequality. When people see their purchasing power evaporate while asset holders get richer. When the social contract breaks down because the economic foundation is unstable. Stage 3 creates stage 4 automatically. Currency manipulation destroys social cohesion. And that brings us to stage 5, loss of reserve currency status, economic isolation. This is where the global system turns against the empire, where alternatives emerge, where the economic weapon that enabled everything from stage 1 through stage 4 gets taken away. Spain lost reserve currency status in the early 1600s. Merchants stopped accepting Spanish currency at face value. They demanded actual silver, not Spanish coins that might be debased. Trade shifted to Dutch and English currencies. By 1650, Spanish money was only accepted within Spanish territory, and even there at discounts. Britain lost reserve currency status gradually between 1944 and 1971. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 made the dollar the primary reserve currency, with the pound as a secondary reserve. By 1956, after the Suez Crisis, Britain's financial position was so weak they had to ask American permission for military action. By 1971, the pound floated freely, no longer a reserve currency at all. The Soviet ruble was never a true reserve currency, but it was the settlement currency for the entire communist bloc. When the USSR collapsed, that trading system vanished instantly. Former Soviet states and Eastern European countries all shifted to dollars and European currencies immediately. And now we're watching stage 5 happen to the United States in real time. In 2023, Saudi Arabia announced oil deals with China settled in yuan, not dollars. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, are developing alternative payment systems. China and Russia conduct bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. The European Union has created payment mechanisms that bypass the dollar. Central banks globally are reducing dollar reserves and increasing gold holdings. This is the beginning of de-dollarization. It's not complete yet. The dollar is still 60% of global reserves, still the dominant trade currency. But the trajectory is clear. Each year the percentage decreases. Each year alternatives grow. Each year America's ability to print without consequences diminishes. And when reserve currency status goes, stage 6 arrives. Rapid collapse, the acceleration phase. where decades of accumulated problems suddenly cascade into systemic failure. Stage 6 is what Americans fear most, and what history says is inevitable once Stage 5 is reached. Spain entered Stage 6 around 1640. Multiple regions rebelled simultaneously. The military couldn't maintain control. The economy imploded. Within a decade, Spain went from global superpower to regional power. They held colonies but couldn't project power. They had territory but no influence. The Spanish century was over. Britain entered Stage 6 between 1945 and 1956. World War II had drained the last resources. They were completely dependent on America financially. In 1956, they tried to act independently during the Suez Crisis, joining France and Israel in invading Egypt. America said no, threatened to tank the pound. Britain withdrew immediately. That moment revealed Britain was no longer a superpower, just America's junior partner. Within 15 years, most of the empire was gone. The Soviet Union entered Stage 6 in 1989 and collapsed by 1991, 900 days from superpower to non-existent. Eastern Europe broke away in 1989. The Baltic states declared independence in 1990. The Communist Party lost control in 1991. By December 1991, the USSR ceased to exist, not from invasion, from internal collapse. The economic foundation gave way, and the entire structure imploded. These weren't slow declines. These were rapid collapses once Stage 6 began. Because Stage 6 is when all the accumulated problems from Stages 1 through 5 hit simultaneously. The overextension, the currency debasement, the social fracture, the loss of reserve status, all cascade at once. The empire doesn't gradually fade, it implodes. And the United States is currently in Stage 5, approaching Stage 6. We have military commitments we can't afford. We have debt we can't repay through normal means. We have a society fracturing along political, economic, and cultural lines. We have a currency we're debasing through unlimited printing. And we have a reserve currency status that's eroding as the world seeks alternatives. The pattern is clear, the historical data is unambiguous. 3 empires, 3 complete collapses, same 6 stages every time, and we're following the script exactly. So, what happens next? What does Stage 6 look like for America? Nobody knows the exact timing. Spain took 80 years from peak to collapse. Britain took 40 years. The Soviet Union took 15 years. The acceleration is increasing with each empire. Maybe America has 20 years, maybe 10, maybe 5. The mathematics say it's inevitable. History says it's already in motion. The question isn't if, but when. What would Stage 6 actually look like? Probably not invasion or military defeat. That's not how empires collapse anymore. More likely economic crisis that spirals out of control. Maybe a debt crisis where treasury bonds suddenly aren't sellable. Maybe a dollar crisis where international trade shifts away so fast that inflation explodes. Maybe a social crisis where the political system can't function and states start acting independently. Maybe all 3 simultaneously. The 6-stage revolution cycle doesn't predict exact events. It predicts the pattern. And the pattern is clear. We're in the latter stages. The acceleration is beginning. And history says, once Stage 5 is reached, Stage 6 follows with increasing speed. Here's what you need to understand. The cycle isn't a conspiracy. It's not a plan. It's mathematics and human behavior. Empires reach their peak and make predictable decisions. They overextend. They debase currency. They fracture internally. They lose economic dominance. And then they collapse faster than anyone expects. Spain thought they were different because of their silver. Britain thought they were different because of their empire. The Soviets thought they were different because of their ideology. And America thinks we're different because of our innovation, our military, our dollar dominance. But the pattern doesn't care about what makes you special. The pattern cares about whether you're overextended militarily, debasing your currency financially, fracturing socially, and losing reserve status economically. And America checks every box. The 6-stage revolution cycle has destroyed every empire that entered it. And there's no historical example of an empire reversing course once they reach Stage 5. Spain couldn't reverse it. Britain couldn't reverse it. The Soviet Union couldn't reverse it. They all thought they would be the exception. They all believed their power was permanent. They were all wrong, and the clock is ticking for us too. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe to this channel. We're going to continue tracking America's position in the revolution cycle. We're going to analyze the specific triggers that could accelerate stage 6, and we're going to discuss what individuals can do to prepare for what history says is coming. The next video will cover the economic indicators showing de-dollarization accelerating, the specific countries shifting away from the dollar, the alternative payment systems being built, and the timeline for when reserve currency status could reach a tipping point. This isn't about politics. This isn't about fear. This is about pattern recognition and historical data. The 6-stage revolution cycle is real. America is in stage 5. And the mathematics don't care about hope or denial or American exceptionalism. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's navigate what's coming together with clear eyes and accurate information. Because understanding the pattern is the first step to preparing for what history says happens next.